For the first time in forever, I hated a sequel to Frozen. For the first time in forever, I felt distaste within my mouth. I don't know if I'm overreacting, but it felt really bad. 'Cause for the first time in forever, I felt disappointed. Oh, that rhymes. I'm not a singer. Okay, so maybe I'm not the best person to be judging this movie, a musical, when I myself can't make the best lyrics on the spot. But, let's face it, it's better than just doing yet another song of me walking in the woods and talking about how I'm either growing old or things are changing or how we're going to change so much in this universe or within this film or within this weird mist in the woods when really in the end we don't do much changing. Frozen 2. I loved the first Frozen movie a lot. This isn't one of those things where I'm like a hater on it or I felt like, oh, it just isn't as good as the other Disney films. No, I liked it. I loved it. It's a movie I've watched many times since it came out. I was very disappointed I didn't see the movie in theaters. I was asleep in 2013, I don't know. But then we have the sequel, which I was excited for because, up to this point, Disney really didn't do sequels. Now, direct-to-video sequels, I don't count. Shut up. That's a different studio. That was Disney Toon Studios, made with the mindset of making a bunch of money. For the most part, the Disney animation studios themselves had never really done sequels. Rescuers Down Under, that is the only very direct sequel. Winnie the Pooh is not technically a sequel. It just takes elements from an already pre-existing material. And, if you really want to argue that Three Caballeros is a sequel, go ahead. It's got the same characters, I guess, but I don't know if that counts. Then we had, out of nowhere, they were making two sequels, Ralph Breaks the Internet and Frozen 2, which makes sense because I guess the Pixar sequels were doing well enough at the box office and even some of them were critically acclaimed, and Ralph Breaks the Internet was a great movie. It was better than the original. It had a lot of reason to exist. It made its own story. You didn't really need to see the first movie to even watch the second one, and it had a very compelling ending. And with Frozen 2, I figured they got the chops to make a sequel. They can make them almost better than the first movie. And Frozen, while I love it, I think it's pretty flawless at times. There's definitely some parts to it that you could fix. I don't think it was the top tier for animation quality or style. I think that could have been amped up. And with the sequel, the animation is a lot better. And it was going to be nearly impossible to top those songs and some of the funny moments. So, the sequel had a lot going for it, but at the same time, it was going to be a tough one to really make its existence worthwhile. And the final product, I can't really explain what this movie is about. And it's hard to even really drop spoilers about it because a lot of the stuff is pretty obvious, but at the same time, it doesn't really seem like there's a driving mystery to this movie. This time we have Elsa and Anna living in the kingdom and things are just the same as they've always been and things never change around here. They even have a song about it. It feels exactly like what a direct-to-video sequel would be like, which shouldn't be the thing I'm immediately thinking of when watching this movie because it's also introducing things we never knew about in the first movie, just out of nowhere. But it kind of works because they bring back the mom and dad character from the first movie. They give them more to work with. The mom actually gets a bunch of lines and they develop a relationship with the children. And then we lead into that opening song. Elsa starts to hear this voice far in the distance and she feels the need to chase after it. The other characters join with her, eventually leading them to the woods where they run into this mist. It's a magical place where all the elements are a spiritual being. Within the mist, they run into people who are from Arendelle, who have been fighting against the natives for the last 30 years. Or were they fighting? Because we don't really know. See, in the beginning of the movie, they show that there was a random fight that broke out of nowhere that broke the tensions between these two parties. The mist pushed them all out, but some of them stayed inside. And I guess they were fighting each other this whole time. At one point, one of the characters mentions it's been 30 years. But it also doesn't really seem like they've been fighting. It seems like they almost kind of have a back and forth at this point, but it's not really tension as much as it is an overall unpleasantness. But it is a movie. I don't always need stuff like that explained to me. I am the most lenient person on the planet when it comes to introducing magical stuff into movies. Stuff that's just meant to be there to, make a cinematic experience. Sometimes if it hits your emotions, you don't really need a deep scientific explanation to everything. But at the same time, it's really annoying when the movie is trying to create this mystery and trying to treat you dumber than you are, because even at times the movie's tricking you into thinking one thing, but the answer to the question is much more obvious than that. And it's not as cool sounding as I just made it. It's not about, it's the obvious answer that is the right answer. Now, instead, it kind of seems like they didn't really have much of a narrative to fill up this movie, so they tried to stretch it along by keeping certain things revealed to the audience later, but not with a lot of payoff. You see, at one point they find out that their mother and father had a connection to these two parties, and that they fell in love and actually came together before the parties had to split up and the mist pushed everyone out. That's how the father and mother met each other. But there's a point where they use water elements, they can use the water, which has memories, to see the past. It's actually a really awesome plot device in the movie, but like I said, they use it to create a mystery, but it doesn't really lead to anything we didn't really know or could figure out on our own. And at one point, Anna and Elsa can notice their father, but they don't recognize the mother. And then they go back later and they're like, that's our mother too. And it's not done in a way where they're like hiding her face. It's not done in any kind of interesting way. It's just that they plain don't recognize her until they choose to recognize her. And I think it's really strange because a lot of the writing is like that, where they just hold back on certain things that the audience can pretty much figure out on their own, but the movie is treating it like it's a bigger, deeper mystery than it actually is. Sure, Kristoff joins them, but he doesn't really have a lot to do with this movie. He keeps trying to propose to Anna the entire time. It's the same thing we saw in that other Disney sequel, Rescuers Down Under, except it was done a lot better and more funny in that one, whereas this one feels tired. In fact, the movie feels so tired about that at a certain point they just kind of give up on the joke, and they drop Kristoff out of the movie, which I thought was really disappointing. At one point we find out one of the characters is from the natives. And I know they're not called the natives. I don't remember exactly what they called them, but that's the metaphor they're going for. That's what they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be natives. And it's a metaphor we've seen done in many movies and kids' movies before, and at times done better, but every time it seems like they don't really develop it correctly or explain it well enough, or they brush over a lot of, important facts about, cultures that clashed with natives. This movie also simplifies it in a really stupid way. But we find out one of the characters comes from the natives, and it's not Kristoff. And I only say that because had it been Kristoff, I think it would have been more interesting and fit with the first movie, where Kristoff kind of came out of nowhere. He worked with the people who were cutting the ice, but they never explicitly said if he was the child of any of them. In fact, it seemed like he was just a lost child, and then he was, taken in by the rock trolls. But that's what I mean. We don't really know a lot about his history yet. We already know everything about Anna and Elsa. The only thing we don't know is where her magical powers came from. But it's figured out in about, 10 seconds, and we don't really need all this extra fluff in the movie that tries to stretch this out for the entirety of the plot. I'm just giving suggestions for what they could have done with Kristoff, but that's not really a good way to criticize a movie. You gotta really look at what it did itself. But what it did do with Kristoff, I thought was really disappointing, because I thought he was a pretty funny, interesting character in the first movie. Anna kind of goes off on her own with Elsa, and that's not the worst thing, because I don't always like when they do introduce new characters in the movie, in a sequel anyway, and try to make them have some kind of importance when they're not really developed well at all. Here, they introduce new characters, but for the most part, they drop them out, which can feel a little awkward as well. Like to go halfway there and be like, we're going to introduce these characters, and we're not going to develop them much, and it kind of gets on your nerves, but then they drop them out, and you're like, Well, I'm glad they didn't try to push them in, but why were they trying to put them in at all? Now I kind of wonder, what was the point of even throwing them in the movie? At the halfway point, it just becomes Anna and Elsa's movie with Olaf, who is slightly more annoying in this movie than he was in the first one. In fact, in the first one, I thought he was fine. I think the trailers made it seem like he was going to be the worst part of Frozen, but they used him the right amount, they gave him the right amount of humor, and it worked. Whereas in this movie, they're giving him way too much, and it just doesn't work a lot of the time. Anna and Elsa go off on their own, and it's not the worst thing to do, because it's nice to see two female characters just go off and be independent on their own. I think that's what the movie is trying to do here. But it doesn't really work, because then you start to retread things you did in the first movie. You know, one of the characters becomes actually frozen. Another character pushes another character away, even though that was the character's flaw in the first movie, and I thought we kind of solved that in the first movie, but instead they decide to go over it again, except this time we don't really have a moral solution to it. Instead, we just, I guess it's just a character flaw at this point, but it's not really touched upon or at all delved into. And then Elsa goes off on her own to this mysterious island with the help of a water horse, which, that's the thing. So it's the four elements. This ancient scarf has 4 diamonds, but within the middle, there's a 5th diamond. The 4 diamonds are meant to represent the elements. There's water, which we see a water horse, who's made up of water, so I think it's just the magical water turning into a horse. And then we have the wind, air, which is just air. It's wind blowing around. We also have, earth, which is another element, and they represent it with these rock creatures, which I guess are meant to be a placeholder for the giant evil snowman in the first movie that couldn't be in this one because there wasn't any snow, so instead they just had some rock monsters. But once again, they are from the earth. I think they're just meant to be the earth's magical properties created in a physical form. And then the 4th element is fire, which is just a salamander. And I'm sure there's probably an explanation somewhere, within some kind of lore or mythology somewhere, about a salamander and fire having some kind of connection. It's just a living salamander. It doesn't really make sense, because of the 4 elements, one of them is a legit living thing, while the others are representations of the elements, and it's kind of confusing. But anyway, there's a 5th element in the middle, and everyone's like, who is that? As they say it to Elsa, who has magical frozen abilities. That's what I mean. Like, it's such an obvious point of the movie. Like, we know where this is building. We know where this is going. She is that 5th property. She is what brings these cultures together. But she goes to the magical island where she brings back a bunch of memories, and it recreates scenes from the first movie in projections, which felt pretty cheap. But then they do this thing where it's like a 3D layout of the first movie, but bringing up really specific scenes from it, like the mayor of Weaseltown doing his chicken dance. They show Hans first meeting Anna. And her singing Let It Go, which I'm like, yeah, you're touching upon some of the more famous moments from the movie, a movie we've all seen many times, and that's what I mean. This movie is strangely addicted to the first one. Not that any sequel has never done that before. I mean, hell, Back to the Future Part 2, the whole movie was basically going back to the first movie. But this one doesn't really do it in an interesting way. They're just kind of mentioning stuff from the first movie. They keep bringing it up. At one point, Olaf retells the whole story of Frozen. Why? I don't really know. It's meant to be funny, I guess. In fact, I thought it would have made a better trailer than it did work within a film. It kind of grinds everything to a halt, and we're just sitting there like, wrap it up, because we've seen Frozen a billion times at this point. But she makes it to the magical island, she sees all the memories, she figures out that the past of Arendelle is actually darker than you thought. And the reason the natives were fighting with the Arendelle people was because, oh, shock, and I'm not going to spoil it for you, but I mean, think of any movie that has ever done this before. I mean, God, Thor Ragnarok just did this plot. They just did it. It's like the same plot again, except this time it doesn't have the same ending. They tried to do the same ending, but it's not nearly as interesting because they kind of cop out by the end. And the ending just is rushed. Like, think of the first movie. It's this big winter wonderland. We find out there's an evil villain twist, which, by the way, this movie doesn't have a villain, which I think would be more interesting than it is if it didn't feel like it needed a villain, because this movie didn't really have much going for it. Maybe they could have added something. Every single fan theory I heard about Frozen 2 sounded more interesting than what the movie ended up being. Well, anyway, instead of having a really cool, awesome, many things going on, epic ending, kind of like Frozen had, Frozen 2 is just a very quick thing where Anna needs to explain what they have to do. She convinces people very quickly who have been standing their ground for years, and she just kind of hops up and she's like, no, we need to do this. And they're like, okay. It's very weirdly rushed, comes out of nowhere, and then the movie ends. Like, yeah, Elsa leaves the kingdom, Anna ends up becoming queen of the kingdom, and Elsa lives with the native people because she needs to be by the woods with the magical powers to make sure everything stays in control. So they're still separated, even though she brought them together, which is still kind of confusing. And even then, the whole thing where two characters, good friends, have to split up and one has to go and do something else, even though they really don't want to split up, but they both know it's for the best. Well, Ralph Breaks the Internet did that, and it did a lot better. Here, it felt like they weren't touching upon any of that. It didn't seem like Anna really did care too much that Elsa was going to be leaving the kingdom, or that Anna needed to take on this different responsibility. They just kind of brush over it all, and there's not really anything, there's no emotion really to this movie. There's nothing compelling going on with the characters. They all sing about change and how this world was going to change them, but I don't really think as many deep changes happened as it thinks it did. The music, not as good, and I don't really blame them because the first movie was going to be hard to top. But a lot of these songs just don't really have that same rhythm or interesting lines or choruses to it. It just, every song feels like a deleted song from the first movie. And that's not the worst thing, because like I said, I think they just struck gold with the first movie and brought out everything they had and made a bunch of good songs. Whereas here, it's just a bunch of mediocre songs and you kind of forget about them. I like some of them, I like the 80s ballad that Kristoff sings, even though it kind of feels like it doesn't really fit in with the movie. Olaf's song's not very good, I don't remember it. The opening song where they're singing it at Arendale's not very interesting. The two songs Elsa gets, I would say Show Yourself is better than Into the Unknown by just a little bit, because the way that scene was edited, presented, animated was much more interesting than what they ended up doing with Into the Unknown. But neither of them are really nearly as good as Let It Go, and it's probably just a taste thing. It's really hard to explain what makes one song, good and the other one's not as good. But I also think it has to do with where that character is in that moment and what it means to them. Let It Go was a much more compelling song because it just meant more for the character, whereas here we're not really discovering anything new with the character. And you would think this movie might be building towards explaining why Elsa has these abilities, but like I said, I don't need that stuff explained. I don't really care to have it explained. I would have wished they just did a different story, but that's not even what the movie's building towards. Instead, it's just kind of building towards a reveal we already kind of figured out by that point. It's kind of amazing, actually, that the characters didn't figure it out at that point. I think there could have been an interesting way they could have presented it to the characters for them to figure it out, maybe have a different reveal by the end. Anna has this really depressing song at one point that, once again, it just doesn't really feel like it fits with this movie. The movie is trying to be darker and sadder than the first movie. It's got a depressing tone at times. I called it, when I went and saw it, I told my girlfriend it kind of reminds me of the Harry Potter series. It seems to have that aesthetic going on, but I don't really know why, because the story isn't really a dark story. It's not really darker than the first movie. It's just the same. It's the same thing again, but not nearly as interesting, and it doesn't have as good of a plot. So what was the point of trying to make it like a darker movie? The movie's not really funny. It's not, the first movie was pretty funny. The first movie also had a couple parts in it which felt slow and boring, so it's not like, it's not a perfect movie. I wouldn't call it perfect. But this movie, it feels like the boring parts of Frozen stretched out for an hour and a half. This movie made me question if the characters from the first movie were nearly as compelling as I made them out to be, and I should never be thinking that while watching a sequel. So overall, Frozen 2 was just a huge disappointment. I really can't think of too much I liked about it other than the animation. The animation is fantastic. They're really stepping up their game. There wasn't any points in it where I felt that it was cheap or rushed, or maybe they were trying to hit a deadline. Here, it felt like they put the right amount of time, effort, and money into this project. But as far as everything else, it feels like maybe the creators were just drained, because it is the same people on board. It is the same people doing the music. It is the same voice actors. But it doesn't feel as fresh or new or as exciting as the first movie. You know, a lot of sequels are hard to pull off, and I figured with Disney, the fact that Ralph Breaks the Internet was a surprisingly good sequel, and hey, they did Rescuers Down Under, and that was also better than the first movie. Maybe Disney had a unique ability to make really good sequels. Maybe that's why they so rarely did them, because when they had a good idea, they ran with it and made it something, you know, unique to the first movie. But Frozen 2 really feels like a cash grab. It feels like, you know, Frozen was successful. We have to do this. We have to do a sequel. We have to do it. There's like no other option. And direct-to-video sequels don't exist anymore because those are stupid. So let's pretty much make a big budget version of that. And yeah, that's how I felt. It felt like a big budget version of a direct-to-video sequel, except without any stupid, you know, common storylines that you would see in one of the other ones, where it's like, oh, it's a midquel, it's taking place during the first movie, or oh, it's about running into this character we didn't know existed, or, you know, someone's parent is still alive. Which I thought they were going to do that for a second. That's the one thing I can give this movie, is that it didn't suddenly reveal that the mom or dad were alive. I never thought I would say this, but Frozen 2 is bad. It's just bad. It's just a bad movie. I think it's just nothing. I'm going to have to give Frozen 2 2 out of 5 stars. It's low. I know it is, but I hate to say it, I just really didn't like this movie. So what'd you think of Frozen 2? Am I being a big time hater? What is it that people really liked about this movie? Because before I saw it, I did read a lot of negatives, but people who liked the movie or gave it a good review didn't really say specifically what they liked about it. So if you have something that I missed, please share. I want to watch this movie again and hope that maybe I just missed something, because whatever it is that people loved about the first movie, I don't think it's here this time. Thanks to all my Patreon supporters. For only $7, you can get your own monthly movie review. Ask me to review anything I haven't already. There's also other perks like blogs, exclusive videos, and early access. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And thanks so much for watching this video.